Shalom, 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 Baruchim Habaim. Welcome. Welcome to Awakening Torat Mussar Mindfulness with the Institute for Holiness, Kehilat Mussar Mindfulness. I am the founder and director. I'm Rabbi Chasya Uriel Steinbauer, delighted to be here with you on Friday morning, January 3rd, 2025, around 9:47 a.m. here in Haaretz in Israel. It is the third of the Hebrew month of Tevet. Excuse me. So we went into the new Hebrew month, Rosh Chodesh, Chodesh Tov. And so we continue. So what are we covering today? For those of you who are following us, or perhaps those who are new to either this live stream or watching us by video later or on podcast, we cover the weekly Torah portion in the Hebrew Bible, the 5 books of Moses. And we are currently in the book of Genesis, of Bereshit, and we're entering the 10th Parasha, the 10th sitting of this year, for what took place on Shabbat, on Saturday, December 28th, 2024. It was the 27th of Kislev, and I'll get to sponsorships and memory and everything there, but this session took place, the Shabbat itself took place on the yahrzeit, on Yom HaZikaron, of Yaakov Wien, someone very special and dear to the Institute for Holiness. May his memory be for a blessing. Passed away, many years ago now. I'm trying to remember when the yahrzeit, when he actually passed away. I don't know, I'm guessing 10 years. I'll have to look it up. But he was a dear and beloved student of mine and practitioner based in New York. Just someone highly devoted to the path of Mussar, and just a devoted, observant, lovely Jew who dedicated his life to justice and tzedakah. And so today, this session is in lovely memory of him, along with my Ima, who, as you know, we just passed the Shloshim mark. Since her death, may her memory be for a blessing, which was on Rosh Chodesh Kislev, and now the 30 days is on Rosh Chodesh Tevet. So in honor and memory of my mother, we want to honor and recognize some lovely, dedicated sponsors who regularly sponsor us and who are quite devoted and are dear to us, essentially. And it's a lovely couple. And just give me 1 second. My brain is not functioning the way it used to, and I'll explain why in a minute. So we know him belovedly as Saba Jeffrey. If he's listening and watching, he'll know. And his dear spouse, Pam. And they were involved in, and then still are, active practitioners and members of Orangetown Jewish community based in New York and New Jersey, New York, and really just connected with us well when we were living there at the time. So Jeffrey Horowitz and Pam, his spouse, have sponsored this session in lovely memory of my Ima. So want to say thank you and deep gratitude to everyone who donates in order to sponsor these public offerings and weekly sessions so that we may offer this to get the vision of the path of Mussar mindfulness out there, so that each of you can not only have a taste of it and practice it during the week, but know that this is a community to take refuge in, that is here, and to build it and make it stronger. So we thank you for your sponsorships. So about my head, before we go into the weekly Torah portion, with the stress of war, as you know, in Israel, multifaceted war. Still those who were kidnapped and remain as hostages. And then the economy has been highly affected here because of the wars. My spouse was laid off because of a lack of income in the college setting. And my daughter is ill. And then my mother, my Ima, has passed. And all that has had this effect. Maybe you've experienced this too, where not everything is at ease and capacity in my head to just retain and pull up immediately. And I notice it especially with names, but it could be as small as like forgetting where I put the cream cheese when I took it out, something like that. So if you too are having multiple high stressors, it's time to practice self-compassion and to realize not to have unrealistic expectations for what you will perform and how you will do in the world. It's time to shift and practice some self-care and to know with time this will pass. It'll pivot. We don't know exactly how it'll look, but to be aware that this is common. So with that, who are we covering? What Torah portion are we covering today? Everyone should jump in and say, I know, right? We are in Mikeitz. Now, Mikeitz, essentially, let me give you where we are for those of you following. I'm fighting a little cold too. Chapter 41, verse 1 to chapter 44, verse 17. Okay? Mikeitz is continuing the whole Yosef story. So if you haven't been following along, Yosef is the 11th son of Yaakov, our third patriarch in the Jewish tradition, Yaakov becomes Yisrael. And he was the favored son of the favored wife, Rachel. If you follow the Torah portion from last time, before his brothers, who are in their 20s and 30s at the time, he was 17, basically acted out with severe ill will and delusion and greed, all the things that we know are the kind of worst, unethical, unskillful hindrances, things that we want to be aware of and avoid on the path. This is an extreme example where they act out and attempt to murder him, decide not to throw him in a pit, essentially leaving him to potentially starve or die of dehydration, or perhaps even be bitten by scorpion, snake, who knows what, and decide in the end to gain from this venture here by selling him into slavery. There's some debate of whether they sold him or if he was taken by other traders who had come through. So that's how Yosef ends up being taken on the slave trade, essentially the Silk Road route from the east to Egypt. He is picked up by spice traders who take him down to Egypt and sell him as a slave. And that's how he ends up down there, okay? I think I will start with just a generalized understanding of this Torah portion, giving us I always give you a quick summary, especially for those of you who haven't read the Torah portion. And then I'll delve into what we need to focus on, especially for our path. What are we to get out of this? In particular, as you know, this year, we're paying attention to what is the master middah, if we can narrow it down to one soul trait, personality trait that's important here to focus on. We're also looking ideally at one Mussar mindfulness practice of the path to be aware of and bring into our lives. And of course, we're also looking at the 48, sometimes up to 51, ways of acquiring Torah from the Mishnah, one of our classic rabbinical texts that lays out in kind of, it's known as Pirkei Avot, which could be transferred as ethics of the fathers, but it's one of my teachers, Alan Moranis, likes to call it the chapter on roots, principal roots, or roots of principles, something like that. So in there, we're going to cover the 10th way we can attempt to acquire Torah, always knowing that we're never going to be able to do 48, that's not the goal. It's like the list in Theravada Buddhism. It's our list of ways that you can figure out what is unique and special to you, that you could do one of these ways to acquire Torah, right? Torah being the master narrative and instruction of how we are to live as Jews. And of course, those joining us, non-Jews, who either identify with no hides or really value and get much out of the path of observing some things from Judaism, in particular, the practice of Mussar, this list of 48 of acquiring Torah can still be of great benefit and use. Okay, summary. Yosef is in another pit, a bore. He's in a prison that he was placed there while he was a slave in last week's Torah portion. Paro, the head of Egypt, known as Pharaoh in English, has two dreams he cannot understand. He calls all his expert dream interpreters to tell him what the dream means, and he's not satisfied with any of them. Now, Paro's cupbearer, as you might recall, was in prison with Yosef, and he's no longer in prison with Yosef. He remembers that Yosef interpreted his dream and the baker absolutely correctly, like meaning how his interpretation of the dream is what ended up unfolding. So he recommends him to interpret Paro's dream. Paro immediately sends for Yosef, who actually says out loud to Paro, it's actually God who is sending a message and God interpreting the dreams. I'm essentially just the messenger, the vessel. And he says God is sending a message that there will be 7 years of plenty of food and 7 years of famine. Now, he doesn't stop there. He doesn't just interpret the dream and then remain silent. So this is where a great analysis of the middah of humility. This is a great place to look at how nuanced it can be. Because you would think someone who is a slave, who's been called by Paro to just interpret a dream, should just interpret the dream and then remain silent. That is his position. That is the amount of space he should take up. He wasn't requested to do anything else. He wasn't demanded or commanded to do anything else. And so when he proceeds, which he does, with in some ways what might seem as great audacity and zerizut, enthusiasm to follow through with an idea and a plan, he moves forward with offering advice to Paro based on this dream. Now, some might immediately look at this and think, oh, this is arrogance, right? From the understanding of the continuum of anava, of humility, that the slave should not speak more than his place, right? No more than my place, no less than my space. However, he does stretch into territory that might seem leaning towards arrogance to offer advice. Now, why is it not in the end interpreted as arrogance? So let's analyze it. And let me finish with the summary, and then we'll dive into this. He advises Paro to store food during the years of plenty. Paro is very impressed by his wisdom and appoints Yosef as second in command. Now, it's Yosef in this process advises that 3 measures be taken to avert the menace of the consequences of the famine if they don't plan, essentially. The selection of a national commissioner, the appointment of regional overseers, and the institution of urban grain storage. Okay. You have to remember this was a 17-year-old boy who lived by a semi-nomadic life, who took care of animals that were in the pasture. Where he suddenly gains this knowledge and knows what to do in a famine, we'll leave it. We'll leave it to Chaim, right? Grace from God, Shefa, abundance. We'll just leave it at that, okay? So let's continue with the summary, and then I'm going to go back to this. So 7 years after the years of plenty in this Torah portion, the famine begins. Yaakov, his father, who he hasn't spoken to this whole time that he's in Egypt, and even now that he's become into power during these 7 years of plenty, when Yosef is acting as second in command, he not once did he pick up the phone, not that there are phones back there, but let his father know that he's alive. Okay, so just hold that for a little bit. Yaakov, Yisrael, sends his sons, the brothers of Yosef, down to Mitzrayim to buy food. But he doesn't send his new favorite and youngest son, also born by Rachel. She dies in birth, giving birth to Binyamin. So you have to understand that the famine ended up going, it was not just in Mitzrayim, in Egypt, it went around the whole area and land. So it stretched into the land of Canaan, and that's why they are starving. And they go ahead and he says, you need to go down to Egypt and procure food for us. So the brothers come before Yosef to buy food, and he recognizes them, but they don't recognize him. Now, lehakir, to recognize someone, is very important. I've touched upon this the past 3 years during this awakening offering, is so important in the Torah. It's one of the strongest concepts besides remembrance, zikaron, right? That it's tied into bina, of a certain form of knowledge, and also yada, which you know something, but it also could mean like a very intimacy, even sexual intimacy. But it's all related. And so when you recognize someone, you are seeing them fully for who they are. I would say that maybe this is the first time that Yosef recognizes his brothers for who and what they really are, and just how dangerous they are. Now you might say, oh, they changed. You find out that they changed after he tests them. But he only knows that after he tests them. The 17-year-old boy didn't recognize his brothers fully, didn't recognize what they were capable of, the extent of their hatred and ill will, the extent of their greed and delusion, that they were willing to kill one of their own in order to feed the greed, hatred, and delusion. He did not see that at 17 until it was too late. Now they are standing before him and he sees them. He recognizes them for who and what they really are and what they did. This is new. Now you have to remember that Yosef is now, when they stand before him, 39 years old. Okay, 22 years later. This should remind you of another story. So when Yaakov runs away, flees from Esav at 17, he finally reunites for reconciliation with Esav 20 years later. This is a theme, right? So 22 years later, the brothers show up, and he recognizes them in all their glory. They don't recognize him. And I would almost say they didn't recognize him also at 17. They only saw the immature behaviors that were essentially egged on and supported by the patriarch, by the father, Yaakov. They did not see him fully as a child created in the image and likeness of the divine. All they saw were the narrative and story they told themselves in their head about him. And in particular, their hatred and anger was really directed to the father, to Yaakov, but they felt, as you know, back in biblical society, in the ancient Near East, there's no way that anger is going to be directed towards the patriarch. So it's directed towards the most vulnerable, which is the 17-year-old boy, the youngest at the time. Okay, let's continue with this, and then we'll go into the middah of Yosef. What led Paro to even allow him to take up more place and space as a slave than he was right for him to do, right? So he stretches in towards arrogance, but it's going to be appropriate humility once it unfolds. But it's because of the other master middah that we're going to touch on. So let me finish with this. So the brothers come before him. Yosef accuses them of being spies. Do you remember the last time Yosef saw his brothers? What was he essentially sent to do by his father? His father said, go check on your brothers. What does that mean when Yosef, the youngest, is constantly sent out, not to do the labor with the older brothers, not to actually be out there in the pasture, but to go check on them and report to the father? He's essentially sending Yosef as a spy, as he did earlier to the other brothers that he told on. It was the children of Zilpah or Bilhah, I can't remember. So he accuses them of what he was sent to do for his father when he was sent to go check on the brothers and report to the father. And then he imprisons Shimon. Shimon is, as you know, a brother who committed genocide in Shechem in response to his sister being raped by Hamor, by the prince of Shechem. And he insists that the others go back to their father and return with the youngest, Binyamin. Okay. So that imprisoning, the throwing Shimon in a pit, essentially he is repeating the scene, almost as common with trauma, of what he did and what happened to him. He was a spy. He accuses them of being spies. He throws Shimon in a pit, just as his brothers had done to him. Okay. So Yaakov, when the brothers return without Shimon, you look at the language here, it is so clear in some ways that Yaakov fully understands what's going on. He finally is lehakir, he finally is recognizing and seeing the brothers for what they are and what is going on. They return without Shimon. He says, you already made me lose. Look at the language. You already made me lose one of my sons, right? Yosef. And now you're making me lose Shimon, and you're going to potentially and most likely make me lose Binyamin. He uses the language that they are responsible. Okay. How does he know that? We finally seen inside to that which has not been spoken by Yaakov. Okay. So at first he refuses to let Binyamin go to Mitzrayim, to Egypt, because he obviously is nervous about losing him as he lost Yosef. Doesn't really trust these other sons to be responsible for bringing back his new favorite son. Finally, Yaakov allows Binyamin, to go with the other brothers because they're all starving. It's a famine. They need more food. The brothers go back to Mitzrayim with Binyamin. When Yosef sees his whole brother, shared by Rachel, he leaves the room to cry. He has a meal with his brothers, but he still does not tell them who he is. Yosef then gives the brothers the food that they came to purchase, and he secretly has a silver goblet placed in Binyamin's sack in order to set him up that he's stealing. When the goblet is discovered, Yosef accuses Binyamin of stealing from him. In some ways, it's not him who stole, but it's the brothers who stole his life from him, his vitality. Essentially, he was in prison from age 17 to, how long is it again? To age 30. The most years of strength and vitality in a young man. And so accuses him of stealing and then says that Binyamin is going to stay behind as a slave. Now, you have to be very careful with this language here. At first, before they find the goblet, that the goblet is discovered in his path, I believe it's Yehuda, but it might be Reuven, I can't remember. It says, none of us stole, and should the goblet be found among any of us, then surely that person should be put to death, right? This is the same language that Yaakov used about the idols that Rachel stole from her father and was sitting on in her tent and wouldn't get up to. She lied to her father and said she was having her menstruation and couldn't get up because he was searching for them in the tent. And Yaakov did not know that when he said what he had said, that whoever actually stole the idols will surely die. Rachel ends up dying on the road while giving birth. And the way our tradition sees it is that there's a relationship between the two. So in some ways, when you hear these words, you immediately think, oh my God, this is the exact same thing. Yaakov 7, Rachel ends up being dead, right? She ends up dying. And the same thing is going to happen with Binyamin, essentially, because he's the one that's going to have the goblet. It's going to be found among him, just like his Ima, and he shall surely die. But instead, Yosef says, no, he's not going to die. There's no interest in that, but he's going to be a slave, and he will stay here with me, and you will go back. And the language used is so nasty. It's essentially the same language that his brothers used towards Yaakov when they returned his bloody katonet hapasim, the beautiful jacket or robe that his father had given him. He says, only he in whose the possession of the goblet was found shall be my slave. The rest of you will go back in peace to your father. Right? Let's look at this again. Atem alu leshalom el avichem. It's like when the brothers show up to the father with the robe covered in goat's blood and say, here, recognize this. Is this your son's jacket? Right? Horrific. Yosef has to know in some ways there's no way they can return in peace to their father. So this kind of, is it called hyperbole, I think in English? Language is very painful, causing harm and suffering. And so let's hold into this, okay? There are obviously so many things we could cover here. I'll start with Yosef. Why on earth would Paro, besides listening to his dream and interpretation, right? Why would he listen to him and let him then even continue speaking with such profound advice of how to manage and run a huge sovereign nation state, essentially? So Paro and his courtiers seem to immediately recognize, lehakir, they see Yosef for who he really is, that Yosef's interpretation of the dream, they are correct, and that the advice is sound. Okay? And they are impressed. There's great impression here by his perception that the dreams are actually one, and that by relating the dreams to national affairs rather than the king's personal interest, Paro's personal interest, and they're also impressed by his social concern that he displays in his advice. His advice is not for him to gain personal power or for Paro too. His advice is about caring for the nation and the Egyptian people. So Yosef is not just content to predict disaster that's coming, right? Famine. Instead, Yosef immediately suggests the measures to alleviate the lot of the Egyptian people. Now, he moves from a dreamer and matures into a dream interpreter. He moves from 17-year-old self-absorption, to concern for the other. Everything is other-oriented. Even when he's in the prison, in the bore, and he hears the pain and anguish of the cupbearer and the baker, he's suddenly concerned about them and wants to help alleviate their pain and suffering by interpreting the dreams, although one of the dreams, of course, is very unpleasant and unwanted. Excuse me. And then when now in this situation with Paro here, he is concerned about the nation state and the Egyptian people. Okay, his wise discernment, his healthy self-esteem, so balanced humility, anava, clear about that it's God that is operating through him, that he is the vessel and he is interpreting because God is actually offering this interpretation. He acts with, as I said, mentioned earlier, zerizut, this balanced enthusiasm of having a plan, moving forward immediately with his suggested execution of the plan, and he does follow through. He's amazing in this middah. And so, yes, we have multiple midot here, but there's something about his personal courage, right? There's great omeds here. You have to understand that Yosef, as I said, just lost the key years of vitality in his life from 17 to 30, being stuck in the bore in Egypt as a slave. This is his damnut. This is his opportunity. And he takes it. He takes it with courage. It's almost as if, what do I have to lose? God is operating through me. God is interpreting the dream. I have a vision and a plan of what needs to be done. I'm going to step forward and say this with the possibility that he could have been executed or thrown back into prison. Why? Because I said a slave does not speak more than what Paro has commanded him to speak. He said, interpret my dream. That was it. He didn't ask for advice of how to manage and run the country. So, any other Paro, especially one that is more of a dictator and power hungry, could have in that instant been like, whoa, slave, like, who do you think you are? Be quiet and, sent him back to the bore. But he doesn't. And Yosef takes advantage of that. Yosef just jumps in almost like, what do I have to lose? Right? There's only one thing worse than being in that bore for more years, and that's death. And in some ways, it is a little death. So he, with great courage, balanced courage, steps forward with God at his side, supporting him, and offers this. And essentially, through that balanced courage and the wise discernment and the healthy, balanced self-esteem of anava and the zerizut, all this together lead him to become the second in power in Egypt to prepare Egypt for the coming famine. It is a master story, one beloved by many generations. Okay, so let's continue. Let's see here. I already mentioned about the spy charges and then the thievery, the accused thievery of Benjamin. When I mentioned the spy charges, because Yosef was sent to spy on his brothers. When you accuse someone of spying, it's because you're accusing them of taking advantage of a weakness. And so, Egypt is obviously going through a famine, and anyone would be concerned that spies are coming to take advantage during the famine. And his brothers took advantage of his weakness, alone, 17. So there's a deep relationship between what's going on here. And then the thievery, right? When you steal, you steal what belongs to someone else, right? Often what is dear to them. And the brothers, essentially stealing his katonet pasim, are stealing what's dear to him and dear to his father. And there's a relationship between all of this. The main theme, obviously, both with Yaakov's behavior of favoring a son over all others and favoring a wife all over all others that he shouldn't have. And then the brothers, that actions always have consequences. This is a key component of the path of Mussar mindfulness. Actions always have consequences, even if we don't see them right away, or we think we're not aware of them, or we're not even thinking of them. And that doesn't mean like the big karma stories, like, I don't know, you kill someone and then you're going to be killed immediately. That's not what we're talking about here. We're talking about when we cause harm and suffering, either to ourselves or others. One, it does affect us at the soul level. It affects our relationships, even if you think you can't see it and know it. And usually there is, as Nechama Leibowitz loves to say, the train will come in. The train of consequence comes in. Okay, so Yosef testing here is because he finally sees clearly, he sees clearly the brothers before them, who they really are. And now I'm going to say something that I'll come back to this point about the economy later. It's going to be controversial, what I'm about to say. But I have to say it. Living here in Israel, you get to know radicalized neighbors, Islamists and jihadists, who are raised in societies that are drastically different from yours, where there's violence daily, where there is a violent internalization of the framework of the world, that there's Islam and everyone else must join Islam or they will be killed or they'll become slaves. And that worldview is that everyone else is to be hated, particularly the Jews, but also Christians, anyone who is not Muslim. And children are from babyhood, toddlerhood, are raised in this culture and in this environment, okay? And in these households, it gets any testimony that you hear from anyone who's left that world, right, who happened to escape, will share with you constant fear and violence, deep patriarchy of the father and then the eldest brother, and how things operate. So if we take a close look at this ancient Near Eastern family who are our ancestors, Yaakov and his 12 sons, okay, you will begin to see clearly that this is like an ISIS-like, Hamas-like family of brothers. They tried to murder Yosef. They threw him in a pit to torture him. They ignored his cries, which I will just bring up really quickly here so you know that, because you don't see that in the earlier Torah portion. It's only in this Torah portion in chapter 42, verses 21 to 24, that they say here, we saw his suffering. They recognized it. We saw his suffering and didn't listen to his pleading, right? When Yosef took Shimon and bound them before his eyes, Reuven even reminds them, did I not tell you, don't do wrong to the boy, and you would not listen? Now we must pay for his blood. Okay, but the big thing here is they say out loud, we get this insider knowledge, and now Yosef has it too. We saw his suffering, and we did not listen to his pleading. Okay, we did not listen to him. This is witnessing trauma, Yosef's trauma, his cries in the pit, were not recorded in the earlier Torah portion. Okay, Yosef is like any terror victim, turned into an object, thrown into the pit. No description of his experience, no reference how he felt. He's treated like a commodity. The Torah, in a sense, essentially does also by listing it such ways. And even recent studies, the trauma suggests when there's no witness to a trauma, besides Hashem, it is difficult to speak about it. One's voice is lost. And if one cannot tell the story, part of the self is lost. So we know that he was, in addition to being thrown into the pit, pleading, crying, screaming, please get me out, help me. And what did they do? They went off to the side to eat. Okay? So they throw him into a pit, then sell him into slavery. This is what ISIS-like brotherhood and families look like. Okay? And what courage of Yosef. Nobody talks about this. Talk about courage. This boy, this man now, what omits. First before Paro, now listen to this. What courage of Yosef to stand before them now, even if they don't recognize them. He recognized. Could you imagine? Just stop for a minute. You are almost killed by your brothers, tortured, thrown into a pit, sold off into slavery by them, and they show up in front of you 22 years later. You are probably going to become that 17-year-old inside again, totally fearful. Your perpetrators are standing before you. And if you can't understand this, especially because it's a boy and a man, just change the gender of Yosef for a minute. Make him into a 17-year-old girl. Make him into a 33-year-old woman. And then you'll begin to see how awful he was treated. All right? So what courage for him to stand there now. If anything, we should be asking, why was he so tolerant of them? They deserved consequences and punishment for their behavior. If you had ISIS-like brothers in front of you, like Hamas is doing in their prisons all the time, murdering, torturing, raping their own people in their own prisons, in addition to our people, there would be consequences for their behavior. They would be punished. So it almost begs, why didn't Yosef take up more space with his own power now and say, I know who you are and I know what you did. And now you're going to be in prison the rest of your life. Because that is the consequences. That's the punishment for someone who kidnaps someone, attempts to murder them, and sells them into slavery. And that is what should have been done to the brothers. Okay, so the fact that he didn't yield his power of consequence and punishment is shocking and probably needed. So they are so privileged and blessed that he gave them the benefit of the doubt and tried them, gave them nisayon, right? Tried them out to see if they would do the right thing and act like brothers and save Binyamin. They did not deserve that. And we would never give that to somebody today who is torturing and raping and murdering and selling into slavery their brother or anyone else in the prisons of Hamas or anywhere else. So why? Why does this have to happen here? And everyone gets all angry at Yosef that he tries his brothers this way. They see it, he's just acting out revenge. This isn't revenge. This isn't revenge at all. Did you forget what the brothers did? If I call them ISIS and Hamas, do you see it more clearly? If I change the gender of Yosef to a girl, to a female, is it more obvious then that how he was treated? This, you can feel and hear in my voice, not only the frustration, but anger and disappointment in our own tradition and the rabbinic exegesis and everything up until now, that we don't see this clearly. I may say it's a gift, God forbid, coming out of October 7th, 2023, that I'm able to see it this way. So we see Yosef with his ISIS Hamas-like brothers. We have Shimon and Levi, who are genocidal, killing all the people in Shechem, the men and boys. We have Reuven, who essentially rapes, lies with his father's wife. We have Yehuda, who decides to sell off Yosef into slavery, and then denies marriage to his daughter-in-law, Tamar. Essentially keeps her locked in married widowhood. Talk about a guna being locked. So let's just face the behavior and who these people are, okay? It maybe I feel a sense of privilege and a obligation to and be able to see this clearly, because so many of us come from families where they're not so healthy, right? You have siblings like this who behave in ways that there should be consequences. So let's move on with what we're going to take from this. So now that we are seeing clearly ourselves too, Yosef at that moment obviously had a choice to hold them responsible, consequences and punishments. He chose not to. He chose instead to try them and test them. We don't have the end of the story yet, but this is what's unfolding. And with his great courage and his faith, his emunah, right? He really always feels that he's being guided by Hashem, by God. And I think because of that centeredness, right? It's Paro that sees in him and says that surely the Spirit of God is residing in you, because that is how he held himself with his courage and his faith, his emunah, right? That God will interpret your dream, right? And it's not simply that Yosef repeated everything is unfolding according to God's plan, and he's merely the messenger. He offers the clear, manageable strategy that will stave off the worst. And even the Netziv, the 19th century Polish commentator, notes that it's precisely the specific details that Yosef's interpretation makes it so believable, right? That is what allows Paro to really believe, and almost the magnetism of his surety, of his faith, of his emunah practice, right? That Hashem is with Yosef, even in the darkest times. And it allows Paro to take a leap of faith, right? To trust in a slave. And decides to elevate him to chief architect and administrator all over Egypt. Very profound. So what are we going to take from this? What are we going to do? How do we acquire Torah, and how do we practice around this? The 10th way we acquire Torah is dibuk chavarim, right? Devik, dibuk, okay? Dibuk chavarim, closeness to friends. I don't like that translation at all. Because it actually means to not only adhere and cleave to, but really like stick yourself to. It's this, it's almost a merging, right? I'm so connected to you. It's what happens in the womb when the DNA of the child goes into the mother, and the DNA of the mother goes into the child. And this word, right, this common idea of chavarim, mean friends or companions, it is what the 10th way of how we acquire Torah. Now, what does that mean? Right? What does it mean to, and here, take friend to mean someone who has their best interest in you, gives you the benefit of the doubt, sees the best side of you, promotes that, is living and walking the path with you. Okay? See it as such. So the Talmud, right? The Babylonian Talmud says, if you happen to meet the Yetzer Hara, which is all a part of us, it's that inclination to cause harm and suffering, right? It says you should drag him or her to the study house. So bring with you that ill will, that greed and delusion into the study house with you, into the Beit Midrash, right? And it says if the Yetzer Hara is stone, the Yetzer Hara will melt. And if it's iron, it will shatter. Why? Because what happens in the study house, in the Beit Midrash, that is where you encounter your chavruta, your vad, your sangha, your community of those practitioners who share the same path of Mussar mindfulness. This is so important, right? Because what you're essentially doing is you're allowing yourself to be fully seen. You're saying, I'm coming in with my greed, hatred, and delusion, and I need you to see me fully for who I am and help me calm it, help me befriend it, so that I act from the Yetzer Hatov, the good inclination to cause goodness, right? The opposite of harm and suffering, to bring good, to bring God's good to others, which is our path. This is the 10th way we acquire Torah, and we do it through spiritual friendship, through the chavruta, the learning partner, through the vad, the group that we practice Mussar mindfulness, where we see each other fully for who we are. We're able to lehakir, to recognize, and to be with it, and to stay with it, and to prevent each other from causing harm and suffering. The problem with the brothers, the ISIS-like Hamas brothers, is that's their vad, that's their community. It's the opposite of spiritual friendship. It's the opposite of dibuk havarim, right? It's that they're shared on a path of greed, hatred, and delusion. They're shared on a path of causing harm and suffering. That is what they share. It's a death cult. It's what we see today with Islamists and jihadists, right? So there's no incense when that group think, it's almost impossible to get out of that, right? To seek the spiritual friendship that's going to get you out. It took Yehuda leaving the family, leaving the ISIS Hamas-like family, to finally take responsibility for his behavior, how he was treating Tamar. If he had stayed in that family, I don't think he ever would have done that. I think he would have left her. That's it. She would have remained living in her father's house, a widow, never be able to get married again. Yeah. So it's very important that when we are, God forbid, in those type of family or community, that we try to get out. We try to listen to that voice and get out and leave, right? So important. There's a reason why in so many of these stories of our ancestors that they leave their family. Even a part of our family, part of our ancestors. When things are not healthy, sometimes you have to leave. Doesn't mean that you leave 100%, that you never relate again or show up for the funeral or whatever it might be. So I will close with a practice. One, I had mentioned fear of God last time, which is really yirah, which is reverence, which is fear and all together. So one of the key practices is bitachon, trust in God, right? But it has to be practiced. And the reason why I bring this is we have to set for ourselves the task in the context of everyday interactions, right? To develop these soul traits, these midot, including bitachon, trust in God. So the minute we feel da'aga, worry, right? Concern arising, it gives us material. We see it as almost a gift and a gift from God, right? To let us know our curriculum, that it's time to shift and pivot and turn to God and trust in God, right? That we recognize it, we name it for what it is, which is the mindfulness. We say, there's worry. I see you worry. Welcoming worry fully within your shadow side, yourself, into the Beit Midrash, into the study hall, with your Vad and Havruta and companions to say, I'm having worry, right? That awareness can meet worry with turning to trusting in God, right? And with community, we then are able to start practicing and moving away from a path of worry. So we do this first by just bringing awareness to it, often by a vehicle for practicing trust in God, often is cultivating hakarat hatov, recognizing the good. Here we have recognize again. Not only do we have to recognize people clearly for who they are, we have to recognize the good in front of us. And we all have it, right? Instead of grasping for other things. So this is a key practice in the path of Mussar mindfulness. And with that, I'm going to move us into a short meditation to actually practice this, which is very, very important to the path. So please assume one of the four postures of Mussar mindfulness. It could be seated like I am, on a chair or a zafu or on the floor. If you are seated in the chair, please really have your feet grounded so that you're held by Mother Earth. It also helps with the meditation of bringing not only alertness, but ease, because it's both body and mind. We need to feel that grounding, the feet planted on the ground and the hips and the whole body deeply seated in the seat, right? Really feeling in the sit bones. You could also walk back and forth. You can lie down and you can stand like in a strong mountain pose. So with that, I invite you to close your eyes if you feel safe and comfortable. Otherwise, just lower your gaze so that you cut out visual stimulation. And we're going to start with 3 deep cleansing breaths in order to really invite ourselves fully here. Like you would invite one of your chaverim, one of your spiritual companions and friends with you here in this meditation. Moving into dibuk chaverim, this real unification and cleaving to, right? This connection and longing, yearning for this deep spiritual friendship and companionship, inviting yourself fully here, mind, heart, spirit, soul. Deep inhalation and exhale. Feel free to make good sounds out. Inhalation and exhale. And finally, this time, raising the shoulders, inhalation and exhale. Letting the shoulders fall, letting your breath fall to its own natural rhythm. Fully arriving with great awakeness, alertness, and also ease. This wonderful gift of self-care, sitting, caring for the self. So let's pay attention. What's happening with your mind right now and your thoughts? How are you arriving? Inviting God here with us to sit with us. Is your mind calm and at ease? Or are you having monkey mind where the thoughts are jumping everywhere? Even if it is calm and focused, notice how even with time, a thought will arise, may even pull your attention away. That is the practice. It's just thousands and thousands of thoughts a day. The practice is when we actually wake up to it. Oh, I was carried off with that thought of pickles in the refrigerator. And so I bring my attention back to my anchor, back to my breath, back to my voice, perhaps back to your body, whatever grounds you. And really bringing this kind of what we call meta awareness, meta mindfulness. It's awareness of awareness. Awake that you are witnessing yourself, aware of what's going on. And bringing your loving attention to the sensations in your body. Anything calling for your loving attention. It's that same type of hibuk chaverim, right? Dibuk chaverim. This cleaving and turning to spiritual companions for our refuge and growth. That we also do it to the friend within. Really strengthening our best selves, our higher self. Knowing that we're on the path and that we slowly acquire Torah together. Anything calling for your loving attention, give a slight bow to it. Just noting it for what it is. No need to change anything or try to fix anything in the body. Just bringing your loving awareness. Sometimes we notice something greater going on in the universe, something large, movement, momentous energy that is not balanced. And when we wake up to that, it's very important to come with even more mindfulness to our daily behavior and to our daily care of others. So I'll give you an example. This ties to Dibuk Haverim. So I notice in my sphere of life, maybe you do too, that there's lots of falling happening lately. Beloved matriarch of our kibbutz and community fell. Physical therapy now, trying to recover. She's in her 70s, trying to gain strength and walk. Then one of my beloved students, practitioner, her husband fell, God forbid, with a massive heart attack. Ended up landing on his head. Such brain contusion and swelling that he ended up passing away. And then the third fall. 3 falls. Again, another practitioner feeling weak, not necessarily paying attention, trips on her own cane as she's turning around and she falls. She's in her 80s. She knew enough and had enough awareness to stay still on her back, wait for care to arrive. And all these people are dear to me. I'm aware of the energy and the universe right now that either we're not paying attention or, God forbid, that just happens to be the conditions that are present right now. And so we be very careful to pay attention to our own bodies in space, and also to turn to each of them. And how can I practice this acquiring Torah, this dibuk haverim, and care for all three, all the ones who have fallen or those they've left behind. And this is part of the practice. This is what it means also to lehakir, to recognize the conditions before us, the circumstances, the people before us, what's happening to them in their lives. How do they need support and love? How can we care for them and ourselves? By living with integrity and knowing that we are doing the best we can, turning and asking, how can I either be of support or how can I not make it worse? We are practicing bitachon, trust in God, by putting that one foot in front of the other. And finally, bringing your loving attention to the emotions, what we call states, flowing through you. How are you arriving right now? Maybe how is that different than how we started the meditation? Maybe you're excited, thinking, I know people have fallen, or I know people in need in my close universe. I'm going to turn to them after this meditation. Maybe you feel excited for yourself. Yes, I'm gonna pause and slow down and pay more attention, care for myself. And with this, we will spend the next moment in silence, and I will pull us out of our meditation. You had your eyes closed, gently and slowly open them to join us back into this sacred Zoom screen live stream on our YouTube channel at Mussar Mindfulness. Please subscribe. If you are joining us through YouTube, if you're joining us through the blog on the website of kehilatmussar.com, please subscribe to our newsletter. Consider joining our community. And maybe you're joining us live stream on Facebook or LinkedIn or Twitter. Do leave a comment suggesting what do you think will be the master middah of our next Torah portion, which you should begin reading Vayigash, which we will read tomorrow, Bezrat Hashem, God willing, on Shabbat. Thank you for showing up and practicing, taking refuge in community together. Again, I'm Rabbi Chasya Steinbauer, the founder and director of the Institute for Holiness.